94% of Jonestown's victims didn't choose to die. That's not a conspiracy theory or revisionist history. That's what the autopsies showed. Of the 914 people who died in that Guyanese jungle on the 18th of November 1978, most had injection marks on their arms. They were held down. Many were murdered. But here's the part that never makes it into the Kool-Aid jokes. The 20 years that preceded that single day were filled with community centers, hot meals, racial integration, and a preacher who made people feel genuinely seen. The deadliest cults in history didn't begin as death traps. Every single one of them started as something people actually wanted. That's what makes them terrifying. That's what makes them worth understanding. The anatomy of a cult. Before we get to the body counts, let's establish what we're actually talking about. Because the word cult gets thrown around so loosely these days that it's lost most of its meaning. Every religion started as someone's weird new idea. Not every weird new idea is a cult. The distinction matters. Cult researchers, including psychologist Stephen Hassan, who escaped the Moonies in the 1970s and spent the next 40 years studying how these groups work, identified what he called the BITE model: control of behavior, information, thought, and emotion. The method is consistent across groups, as different as Jonestown and Heaven's Gate and the Rajneeshees. If a group controls what you do, what you're allowed to read or hear, how you're supposed to think, and then weaponizes your emotions against any doubts you might have, you're not in a spiritual community. You're in a trap. The groups that end up on lists like this one share a few specific features. The leader claims a direct line to God, the universe, aliens, or some other authority that cannot be questioned by mortal humans. Members are gradually isolated from family and friends outside the group, because outside relationships are the most likely source of reality checks. Sleep deprivation, dietary restriction, and endless group activities keep the mind too exhausted to think critically. And the process is always gradual. Nobody sits down at their first meeting and thinks, yes, I would like to eventually die for this man. They're recruited with warmth, community, and a sense of purpose. By the time the demands get extreme, leaving requires admitting that years of their life were a mistake. Most people can't do that. Former cult members include lawyers, doctors, university professors, and at least one person who once had a perfectly functional salad bar. The only weak people join cults myth is one of the most dangerous misconceptions in this entire field, because it convinces educated people they're immune. They're not. If anything, idealists with a strong desire to make the world better are exactly who cult leaders are looking for. Jim Jones and the Temple That Poisoned a Nation. Jim Jones was born in 1931 inches rural Indiana, to a mother who believed he was a messiah and a father who was largely absent. As a child, he conducted funerals for dead animals and became obsessed with death in a way that his neighbors found unsettling even by Indiana standards. By his 20s, he had figured out that religion was the fastest route to the kind of power he wanted. The People's Temple he founded in Indianapolis in the 1950s was, by the social standards of the era, genuinely radical. Jones built one of the first racially integrated congregations in Indiana, fed the poor, and preached a gospel that blended Christianity with socialist politics. He also staged fake faith healings using plants in the congregation, had followers gather cancer from sick members, actually chicken giblets. But nobody was doing a lab analysis mid-miracle, and privately told his inner circle that the whole God thing was nonsense. He considered himself the only real power in the room. By the 1970s, the temple had relocated to San Francisco and built a political machine impressive enough that Jones became friends with Mayor George Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk. When a reporter from New West magazine started digging into abuse allegations, Jones decided California had become inconvenient and moved the entire congregation to a jungle compound in Guyana that he called Jonestown. Jonestown was supposed to be a utopia. It was, in practice, a plantation. Members worked from sunrise to dark in tropical heat, surviving on rice and beans. Jones blasted his voice through loudspeakers around the clock, barely slept himself. He was deep into drug addiction by this point, and conducted what he called white nights, late-night assemblies where members were told to drink poison, then revealed it was a test. He rehearsed them for death, multiple times. He told them that when the end came, they would be committing revolutionary suicide as a protest against capitalist oppression. In November 1978, Congressman Leo Ryan flew to Jonestown to investigate reports from concerned families. He was allowed to visit, managed to collect a group of members who wanted to leave, and was shot dead at the Port Kaituma airstrip along with 4 members of his delegation. Jones knew what was coming after that. He ordered the poison mixed. The cyanide was in a vat of grape Flavor Aid, not Kool-Aid, a distinction that the Kool-Aid company has been trying to establish for 4 decades. Parents were instructed to squirt it into their children's mouths with syringes. Some members drank willingly. The autopsies on the others told a different story. Of 914 people who died that afternoon, 303 were children. Jones himself died from a gunshot wound to the head, ruled as self-inflicted. though some accounts suggest otherwise. He was 47 years old. He had been killing people, one way or another, for most of his adult life. The Heaven's Gate departure. Marshall Applewhite was a music professor in Texas who, in the early 1970s, was fired from his position at the University of St. Thomas for an inappropriate relationship with a student and subsequently had a breakdown that landed him in a psychiatric hospital. While he was there, he met Bonnie Lou Nettles, a nurse and enthusiastic astrology devotee who convinced him that the two of them were the two witnesses, described in the Book of Revelation, sent to Earth to prepare humanity for the next level of existence. Quite a lot to get from a psych ward stay. Nettles and Applewhite, who began calling themselves Bo and Peep, and later Do and T, spent the 1970s gathering followers with a message that blended UFO theology with Christian apocalypticism. Their core belief was this: human bodies are merely temporary containers, Earth is about to be recycled, and the only way to survive is to shed your earthly attachments, follow the program, and be picked up by an extraterrestrial spacecraft when the time comes. Jesus, they explained, had arrived on Earth in a spacecraft. His ascension into heaven was just the ship leaving. This seemed to resonate with a particular type of spiritually curious American in the post-Watergate era, because by the time Applewhite went public again in the 1990s, he had a devoted following numbering around 40 people. Bonnie Nettles died of cancer in 1985, which posed an obvious theological problem since she was supposed to be immortal. Applewhite revised the theology to fit and continued. The group lived communally, moving around the country and eventually settling in California. They built websites for income, they were genuinely early adopters of the internet, wore matching outfits, kept their hair closely cropped, and observed strict celibacy. Several male members, including Applewhite himself, voluntarily underwent castration to reduce what they considered earthly distraction. In 1995, the Hale-Bopp comet was discovered, and an amateur astronomer published a claim that something large was following the comet. The claim was quickly debunked by actual astronomers, but Applewhite was already convinced. The companion object was a spacecraft. It was coming for them. The timing was right. In late March 1997, as Hale-Bopp made its closest approach to Earth, Applewhite and 38 of his followers consumed a lethal mixture of phenobarbital mixed into pudding or applesauce, washed down with vodka, and lay down to die in a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. They did it in shifts, over 3 days. The first group died. The survivors bagged the bodies neatly, laid down themselves, and repeated. Each person was found in identical Nike Decades sneakers and black clothing, with a $5 bill and 3/4 in their pocket. The exact meaning of the loose change remains unclear. 2 further members committed suicide in the months that followed. The group's website was maintained by surviving members for years afterward. They kept it up, they said, in case anyone needed more information. Aum Shinrikyo, the cult that tried to start World War III. Shoko Asahara was born Chizuo Matsumoto in 1955 inches Japan, partially blind from birth, and spent much of his childhood at a school for the visually impaired, where, by multiple accounts, he bullied younger and more severely blind students mercilessly. He moved to Tokyo in his 20s, failed the entrance exam for Tokyo University, and eventually built a career selling herbal remedies out of his apartment. Several of those remedies were fraudulent. He was convicted of selling fake medicines in 1982. This is who you're dealing with. By 1984, he had rebranded himself as a spiritual teacher, opened a yoga school in Tokyo, and begun weaving together an ideology pulled from Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, and the Book of Revelation, centered on his prophecy that a third world war was imminent and that only his followers, whom he was personally guiding toward enlightenment, would survive. The fees for his instruction were substantial. By the early 1990s, Aum Shinrikyo had roughly 10,000 members in Japan and an additional 30,000 in Russia, where collapsed Soviet infrastructure made spiritual searching particularly common. Asahara ran for parliament in 1990 with a full slate of Aum candidates. All of them lost, badly, and voters caught on camera laughing at them during the campaign. He took this personally. The loss appears to have been the pivot point from aggressive spiritual tourism operation to doomsday terrorist organization. Over the next few years, Aum systematically murdered members who tried to leave, killed a lawyer named Tsutsumi Sakamoto, along with his wife and infant son, because Sakamoto was helping families retrieve members from the group, and began producing chemical weapons at scale. In June 1994, they conducted a sarin attack in the city of Matsumoto, a sort of field test that killed 8 people and injured hundreds more. Japanese authorities initially suspected a local resident. Nobody charged Aum. 9 months later, on the 20th of March 1995, 5 cult members boarded 5 separate Tokyo subway lines, each carrying bags of liquid sarin, punctured them with umbrella tips at pre-arranged times on trains, converging toward a single station near the Tokyo Metropolitan Police headquarters, and walked off. 13 people died. Approximately 5,500 others were treated for injuries. Asahara was captured hiding in a wall cavity in the cult's compound in May 1995. He was tried, convicted, and executed in July 2018 along with 6 other Aum leaders. The group has since rebranded as Aleph and continues to operate in Japan, monitored closely by authorities. They still have members. Some people find this even more disturbing than the Sarin, the Solar Temple, and its very dramatic exit strategy. The Order of the Solar Temple was a secret society founded in 1984 by a Belgian homeopathic doctor named Luc Jouret and a French businessman named Joseph de Mombreau. The ideology was a remarkable mixture of Neo-Templar mythology, Rosicrucianism, and New Age beliefs about solar energy and cosmic transition. Their membership was not the usual cross-section of the vulnerable and the desperate. These were wealthy Europeans, doctors, architects, business people, and at least a handful of former government officials. The dues were high. The apocalyptic cosmology was apparently compelling enough. De Mombreau had a daughter named Elodie, whom he had, from birth, designated as the cosmic child, a being of special spiritual significance sent to Earth to fulfill a prophetic mission. Elodie grew up inside the cult, believing this about herself, which is worth mentioning when we get to what happened next. By the early 1990s, de Mombreau and Jouret were growing increasingly paranoid, convinced that law enforcement in Switzerland and Canada was closing in on them. They also had an intense grievance against a couple named Tony and Nikki Dutoit, former members who had left the group. The Dutoits had a baby, a boy they named Christopher Emmanuel, which de Mombreau interpreted as a deliberate provocation, since a cosmic child named Emmanuel was supposed to be born within the temple. He told followers the Dutoit child was the Antichrist. On the night of the 30th of September 1994, 3 cult members broke into the Dutoit home in Morin Heights, Quebec, stabbed Tony and Nikki Dutoit to death, and killed 3-month-old Christopher Emmanuel by stabbing him through the heart with a wooden stake. 2 nights later, in a farmhouse in Carey, Switzerland, 23 members were shot and killed. 25 more died in fires set across properties in Salvan, Switzerland. Among the dead were Jouret, de Mombreau, and Elodie de Mombreau, the cosmic child, who was 12 years old. The total from the 1,994 events was 53 deaths. 16 more members died in a fire in France in December 1995, and 5 more in Quebec in March 1997. The final death toll was 74, spread across 3 countries over nearly 3 years. Unlike most of the cults on this list, the Solar Temple's deaths were a mix of genuine suicides, assisted deaths, and outright murders, many carried out on members deemed insufficiently loyal or spiritually ready. Some of the victims had been told they'd receive refunds on money they'd given the temple if they came to a final meeting. They showed up. They did not get refunds. David Koresh and the Waco Inferno. The Branch Davidians were a splinter group of a splinter group of a splinter group of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. By Waco in 1993, we're dealing with several generations of theological drift from the original doctrine. The group had been based at Mount Carmel Center, a compound outside Waco, Texas, since the 1950s. David Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell in 1959 to a 15-year-old single mother who he didn't meet until he was 3 years old, joined them in 1981. Koresh had a particular gift. He had memorized large portions of the Bible and could hold court for hours on its interpretation in ways that group members found genuinely revelatory. He also played guitar and had the kind of charisma that experts on cult psychology consistently identify in leaders. An uncanny ability to read people and locate the specific need or wound that could be exploited. He took over the group in 1987 after a power struggle that involved a literal shootout with the previous leader at the compound. Nobody was killed, charges were filed, charges were dropped, and Koresh was in charge. His signature theological innovation was the House of David doctrine, by which God had revealed to him that he was obligated to father children with multiple women in the congregation, including the wives of other members and girls as young as 12. He annulled the marriages of male followers, so their wives could enter his spiritual family. He had a rock band, called Messiah, that performed at local bars while he recruited. By the early 1990s, federal authorities had concerns about the number of firearms being stockpiled at Mount Carmel, and about child welfare inside the compound. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives raided the compound on the 28th of February 1993. The raid went catastrophically wrong. 4 ATF agents were killed, 16 were wounded, and 6 Branch Davidians died in the initial exchange. What followed was a 5-1-day standoff in which FBI negotiators and tactical teams operated at complete cross purposes, with negotiators building what they believed was progress, while tactical commanders authorized moves, including sleep deprivation via not God. Koresh interpreted as confirming his prophecy that the government was coming to destroy them. On April 19, FBI tanks began pumping CS gas into the compound. Fires started inside. The source disputed to this day between the government and surviving branch Davidians. 76 people died, including 25 children. Koresh died from a gunshot wound, the shooter unidentified. A federal jury later found that the branch Davidians had fired first, and that the government was not responsible for the deaths. Not everyone agrees. The Waco siege became a galvanizing cause for American anti-government militia movements. Koresh's actual crimes, particularly the systematic sexual abuse of children, were largely buried under the argument about government overreach. This is worth noting: the Oregon salad bar that changed American security forever. This one is different from the others. Nobody died. But the Rajneeshees committed the first and largest bioterrorism attack in American history, which qualifies as historically significant by any reasonable standard, and the story is so aggressively strange that it would be a disservice to leave it out. Bhagwan Sri Rajneeshee, later known as Osho, was an Indian philosopher and spiritual teacher who developed a significant international following in the 1970s. He was charismatic, controversial, openly provocative, and by 1981, the owner of 93 Rolls-Royces. His commune in India had grown large enough that tensions with local authorities made relocation appealing. His followers purchased a 64,000-acre ranch in rural Oregon, and within a few years had built a full planned community called Rajneeshpuram, with its own zip code, airstrip, post office, and police department. The actual running of Rajneeshpuram was handled by Rajneeshee's personal secretary, a woman who went by Ma Anand Sheela. The Bhagwan himself maintained an official posture of detached spiritual authority, while Sheela ran what was, in practice, a fairly aggressive real estate and political operation. When Waco County elections in 1984 threatened to produce local officials unfriendly to Rajneeshpuram's land use ambitions, Sheela developed a plan to suppress the vote by making enough local residents too sick to go to the polls. In a small shed on the ranch, cult members cultivated Salmonella typhimurium using petri dishes, an incubator, and a freeze dryer, then deployed it across the salad bars of 10 restaurants in the Dalles, the nearest town of any size. 751 people became ill, 45 were hospitalized. The victims ranged from an infant born 2 days after his mother's infection to an 7-year-old. Nobody died. Partly because the dose calculations were imprecise, and partly because local Oregonians, suspicious of the commune and determined not to let it take over county government, turned out to vote in large numbers anyway. The plan failed on both counts. Rajneeshee eventually held a press conference in 1985 to accuse Sheela and others of running a criminal enterprise without his knowledge, which is a bold position to take when you are the person they were theoretically doing it for. Sheela was arrested in Germany, extradited, pleaded no contest to numerous charges including the poisonings, and served 29 months. Rajneeshee himself was deported after pleading guilty to immigration violations. He died in India in 1990. The Osho brand survives, with meditation centers on multiple continents, and many followers still maintain the crimes were entirely Sheela's doing. Why smart people follow someone off a cliff? The question people always ask about these stories is some version of, how? How did a Harvard-educated doctor end up in a cult? How did a music professor convince 39 people to mix phenobarbital into pudding? How does anyone get from, this community feels meaningful, to, I should stab an infant because my leader says it's the Antichrist? The honest answer is that it doesn't happen all at once. Nobody recruits you for the part where you're sleeping 4 hours a night on a jungle compound being injected with poison. They recruit you for the community potluck, the sense of belonging, the feeling that someone finally understands you. Research on cult recruitment consistently shows that the most vulnerable moment isn't one of obvious desperation. It's transition. A new city, a recent loss, a graduation, a divorce. Any moment when the old social structures have loosened and a person is temporarily open to new ones. Love bombing is the technical term for what comes next, and it works even when people know the term. The group showers new members with warmth, attention, and validation in quantities that most people don't receive in ordinary life. By the time the demands escalate, members have already reorganized their social world around the group. Leaving means losing your community, your identity, and, frequently, your entire understanding of reality. The sunk cost isn't just financial, it's existential. This isn't weakness, it's vulnerability, and those are different things. The survivors of groups like Jonestown and Aum Shinrikyo and the Branch Davidians are not people who were gullible or simple. Many of them were idealists who wanted to change the world. They found someone who told them he knew how. That's the pitch. That's always the pitch. The reckoning. 94% of Jonestown's victims didn't choose to die. They made 1,000 smaller choices that got them there. They chose to trust a charismatic preacher who fed the poor. They chose to move to a new city when the church relocated. They chose to stay when leaving got complicated. They chose to believe, because believing felt better than the alternative. And then, one November afternoon, they ran out of choices. The Solar Temple's doctors and lawyers paid serious money for the privilege of being murdered in a Swiss chalet because they believed a man in robes had the answers. Heaven's Gates members wore matching Nikes into the afterlife because a music professor told them the comet was their ride home. Aum Shinrikyo's chemists produced sarin in a country where that level of scientific education is supposed to produce breakthroughs, not body counts, because a partially blind fraud convinced them they were on the right side of the apocalypse. The mechanism doesn't change, the outfits do. Salad bars in Oregon, Tokyo subways, Swiss chalets, a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, a jungle in Guyana. The tools vary. The playbook is identical. And the reason historians and psychologists keep returning to these stories isn't morbid fascination. Though, let's be honest, there's some of that. It's because the playbook keeps working. Right now, somewhere, someone is in a love-bombing phase, getting more warmth and belonging than they've ever felt, and slowly, not noticing what's being asked in return.